I'll talk a little bit about my background. I've been in Santa Fe, New Mexico for 12 years. I moved here from Park City, Utah. I've been in the West for about since 2005. Um, yeah, and when I moved here, I didn't initially move to Santa Fe. I actually moved to a little town about 30 something, almost 40 minutes out of town called Galisteo. And it stole my heart. And you'll see some um, nods to that kind of landscape. I'm really drawn to the kind of arid desert landscape. Um, my background is I grew up actually in Virginia. So Norfolk, Virginia, on the coastal side. I have a very crazy story as a child. I lived on sailboats and sailed. So I was about as far away from the desert as you could possibly get. So I grew up sailing and spending a lot of time on the water, and I always wanted a horse. Since I was a kid, my parents were into sailing, so I had a seahorse as a pet. Like, for real. So, yeah, my pet seahorse. So, anyway, so how did I arrive at this point in my career? I started painting when I was really young. My grandfather was what's called a toll painter. Does anybody kind of know that word? Tolle, toll painting? Back in the day, in the 80s, kind of 70s and 80s, they would paint on furniture, little motifs on furniture. Like, I think back in the 70s, like mushrooms. I remember they would paint like little irises or little kind of motifs, kind of very like Dutch style furniture, also like jewelry boxes and things like that. So that's what my grandfather did. He built furniture, and he introduced me to my first set of oil paints as a paint by number set. Do you remember paint by number sets? What happened to paint by numbers? They were great. But what happened for me is when he opened the little capsules of each one of those paints, I remember the smell of linseed oil hitting my nostrils. I can still remember that smell of, when you go into a studio and you smell oil paint, that fresh paint. It hit me, it stayed with me my whole life. I was probably around 4 or 5 years old. So I did these paint by numbers, and in my rebellious style, can't tell I'm rebellious or anything, can you? I'd use the paint to actually paint outside the lines and then to start painting my own paintings. I just wanted to paint. And my grandfather taught me how to do the toll painting, and I began painting on the furniture, and him and I were a collaborative team, and I sold my first painting when I was 8 years old. Essentially, I painted furniture and we sold them. They had no idea a little child was painting these things. So that's how I got started. That was in South Georgia, and from there, my parents moved to Virginia, and that's kind of where I grew up on the ocean sailing. And I have my grandfather to thank for teaching me how to paint. And I had a kind of an unconventional beginning, and then also because my parents were sailors, they encouraged me in art, and I had kind of mentor artists that were in the sailing community, believe it or not. A lot of people that were boating people would be painters and painting, these wonderful scenes at the ocean. And so my father would run down the dock. He'd see someone coming in that was like a watercolor. He'd say, "This person's a watercolor, so you got to practice with my daughter." And each time I was lucky, they didn't buy me those little sets, that are kind of in those pans. They bought me the tube watercolor paints, and they would say, "These are precious because they're professional grade paints." So I kind of started like that, and then I went into kind of an atelier style education in art. So I have a very strange upbringing. So I always had artist mentors when I was young, junior high, that point in my life. And from there on, I actually got into some programs. In Virginia, we're very lucky. We had a lot of funding for the arts in Virginia, and I was part of the first magnet school program in the country. So if you've ever heard of the Governor's Magnet School for the Arts, I was actually the first graduating class pilot program for the United States. And it was fantastic. We didn't actually have like a school yet, so actually I just would go to high school in the morning, and then I was bused to the local to the local universities where I studied academic style painting. Because of that, my early beginnings in painting was learning to paint and draw from life. So I always had models and or model figures that we would draw from. You know, traditionally in academic style painting, we're not allowed to even paint for a couple years. You have to draw forms, like these kind of cast mold forms. And that was my beginnings in learning how to draw the form and then learning how to paint the form. So when you look at my work, you might kind of see that kind of sense for modeling the form is still there. That's kind of some of my early beginnings with that. So painting from life, drawing the figure, then painting the figure, and lo and behold, I find myself in the West and kind of segueing back to being in the ocean. I always wanted a horse. That was my thing. My parents were like interested in the ocean. I moved west, and when I ended up here in Galisteo, the first thing I saw was this beautiful Galisteo basin set before me. And I said, oh my goodness, this is it. And there was something about this space, and I realized it was not that far from where I had actually come from, because what was it about this space? You know, it took me a while to kind of analyze and figure it out, but the openness is very similar to my own upbringing on the ocean, right? Just looking at expand. In fact, the Galisteo Basin was an ocean. And if you squint your eyes in the right light, you can see it and all the islands. And that makes me so happy. It really is something that touches my heart. Just kind of segueing back to the art part, I eventually went to school. I went to West Virginia Wesleyan, studied painting, and I was interested in I saw George Baselitz and some German expressionists, and I had been trained in a classical sense of painting. So I painted from life, painted naturalistically, and then I saw something different in this kind of work. And I said, what is that? And I realized there's something more to painting than just depicting a form. And that's when my life started changing. And my career started, my passion for art started changing. I realized that you could say something in your work more than just articulating the form itself. And so I kind of took this, I looked at George Baselitz, I was very interested in Susan Rothenberg, I was willing to clean her toilet at one point to get near her because I thought her work was amazing. Ironically enough, when I moved to Galisteo, I moved right down the street from her. And I wasn't willing to clean her toilet at that point, but so I kind of made a segue. So my career went through kind of realism into expressionism and then even into abstraction. So I started showing professionally 35 years ago. And I'm 53 years old, so I started kind of young. And unlike GL and Jim back there, I sabotaged every thing. I sabotaged any other career path. So basically, I couldn't do anything else because I was basically unemployable. I did that on purpose because I knew I had to paint. Someone asked me earlier, because I asked, what is it that you want to know? And they said, at what point did you decide? Every artist decides at what point they are an artist in their career. And I think for many of us, you hear the story over and over again, we always knew. And maybe the driving force is a little different, but we always kind of knew. I knew from a young age. So anyway, I was doing abstract work, and then I came out west in 2005. And when I was hit, and I moved to Park City, Utah at that point, and I was looking at the landscape and looking at other landscape painters. I said, I want to paint this, but I really didn't know how. And rather than kind of just painting some landscapes, I said, I will not paint landscapes until I find my own voice in that landscape. That's the only way I'd show it. I didn't want to just paint landscapes. I want to figure out, what is this for me, So I took several years off just to paint and explore, and I was a rock climber. That's what brought me to Utah. And I spent a lot of time in the landscape. I started experimenting with bringing kind of expressionism into the work. And kind of what you're seeing now, kind of going into what you see currently is I do a lot of work outdoors. I do a ton of plein air painting, which is kind of harkens back to my roots of painting, always painting from life. Back in the day when I was going to school, there was no digital cameras. It was very difficult to get an image to paint from. So you pretty much had to kind of study your subject that way. So that's kind of why my work has kind of I call it an alla prima bent to it. And alla prima is a word, some of you might know what that means. Alla prima is Italian for in an instant. So even though these are mostly studio paintings around me, you'll get a sense that there's a sense of like a gestural quality, and my work tends to be very painterly because I do work in the field so very much. So I do kind of this series of work. How it looks for me, like painting, is I'll go out and I'll paint these plein air paintings. They're like about 6 by 8 or 8 by 10. I have stacks of them around the studio, and I use those as reference material to paint the larger paintings that I paint. I start painting my work directly. I do no pre-drawing. I just start painting it. And the other thing that's crazy about it is I put the reference material away at some point, and I mostly paint from memory. It forces me to kind of deal with the emotive content of the work. So it's not strictly just a painting of a thing. It's like I kind of try to remember what was it about this place that compelled me to remember it, to want to articulate it and to share it with others. So, there's some of that. Well, let me talk about this painting behind me real quick, because I think it might be something. This painting is of a place. I was on my way to Tucson. So you may recognize if you drive from here to Tucson. This is in Deming, near Deming, right on the border of Arizona. And I love the spaces out there. And someone said to me, it kind of looks like a Maynard Dixon painting. And I do love his way of articulating cloud shadows. And this is called Cloud Shadows Dancing. I stopped the car, got out. I was so compelled by the shadows in that expansive space. One thing about painting kind of the desert, and this really speaks to you all living in Tucson, is that the expansiveness is what captivates me. How do you articulate expansiveness in a contained space? I mean, the picture frame horizontally stops on both sides, but how do you give that sense? We all know that experience, but what if I'm showing this to someone back east? How do they relate to that? So I like to set up these little kind of problems, or these little kind of things that I like to solve. Like, how do you make it look so that someone would understand what it is I'm trying to show them about? Basically, these paintings are all really personal. They're about my life. They're about what I see and want to share with others. Thank you. Thank you for having me.